on for 300 years. And he came here when he was really quite young, but you probably don't think it was quite young. He was about 23 when he came here. I suppose that seems quite old to you children, doesn't it? But it seems young to me. And he came here to Malton with his wife to live in a little cottage that we'll go into in a few minutes. And it was a shoemaker's cottage because he was a shoemaker. And he came here because it was a shoemaker's cottage. And when he got here, he found there was a little Baptist church just the other side of this wall. And we'll go and have a little look in there in a minute, but it looks very different from what it looked like when he was here. And he and Dorothy, his wife, I think they were hoping to start a family quite soon. They'd lost a little girl, sadly. In those days, lots of, there wasn't the same sort of medicine arrangements in those days. So anyway, they were hoping to start a family in Malton here. And that's what happened, because 3 little boys were born here in 4 years. So they were kept quite busy with 3 and 4 years, weren't they? Dorothy certainly was, and I hope their dad was kept busy as well. And this tells his story really, because it tells about when he was born and grew up in a little village near Towcester called Paulusbury, and he lived in a tiny village that was surrounded by forest, and what he fell in love with when he was a little boy was all the flowers and birds and animals and insects and butterflies and all that sort of thing, the world of nature. That's what he fell in love with when he was a little boy. And he was very fortunate to go to school when he was 6 or 7, because his dad, who was really a weaver making cloth, he became schoolmaster in the village. Not because he was particularly clever or had been to college or anything like that, but just because people thought he was a good man, and he was good enough to teach children who couldn't afford to go to proper schools, because you had to pay in those days quite a lot of money to go to school. And people who were a little bit poor didn't have the chance to go to school at all. But Carey, William, learnt to read and write at this school, and he loved books. Do you love books? I wonder what sort of books are your favourite books? What do you like best of all? He liked adventure stories. Do you like adventure stories? And he loved stories about explorers who were exploring the world. And in those days, there were lots of places where people had never been and didn't know what was there at all. And he thought being an explorer was the best thing in the world, to go and discover new places. Little did he know that one day he would become God's explorer in India. Because he was so interested in birds and flowers and all that sort of thing, whenever he went out for a walk, it took him an awful long time to get from here to there. His mum probably wondered what had happened to him, but he was carefully examining things. And up here, he's looking at birds' nests and looking at what their eggs are like, and finding that they're all different from different species of birds. And this was the beginning of him becoming a famous scientist. And he certainly put his knowledge of science to good use when he got to India. And this was his Uncle Peter. He'd come back from Canada, living in Canada, and he told him stories about Canada. Oh, it sounded wonderful to William. He loved hearing about faraway places. And he went to this church, which was the Church of England, an Anglican church. Not sure it meant all that much to him really as a little boy, But when he was 14, he left home and went to a village not too far away where he could learn how to make shoes from leather. And he became a shoemaker, and he could mend shoes as well. And what happened to him there was that he went to a church that wasn't the Church of England. It was a little meeting house, and there he gave his life to Jesus and became a Christian himself. He was 17 when that happened, and it wasn't long before he was learning how to preach. And he may well have preached at this little chapel once, because he would have gone round lots of villages and preached in their churches. And so when he came here with Dorothy, they said to him, "Oh, we hope you'll preach for us." "Yes, I'll give you my free Sundays," he said. And then it wasn't long before they were saying, "Oh, we wish you'd become our minister." But you know, this little chapel, the other side of here, was really falling down. And when Carey eventually became the minister of this church, he started a building appeal. And he begged for money. He went round different churches in quite a big area and asking them if they would give him some money to rebuild this church. And this is a little letter that he had printed that he took with him. And in it he said, "Oh, we're in danger of being buried alive in this church. It looked as if the ceiling might fall in on them. Don't lean on the wall, it might give way." And he did get some money together, and before he left, he had got the church rebuilt. So today, we're quite grateful to William Carey here, because I don't think there would have been a little Baptist church here if he hadn't been here. And these things here are things that I took out of the museum, actually, that you might like to look at, because we had a big crowd yesterday, and I knew that once they were in the museum, they wouldn't be able to look at things properly. So that's the letter, the appeal letter. And this, when he became the minister, he drew the church into a covenant or promise. They all had to make promises when they joined the church. And he wrote this promise or this covenant in this book. And this is a book with some of his handwriting in. And do you think you could read that? It's quite difficult, isn't it? But it's quite neat, don't you think?
Yes.
But that's his handwriting.
That's like calligraphy.
That's his handwriting in this book. And this book is a bit delicate, so we have to be very careful with it. And what else he did here was he had a little school in his house. Fancy going to school in a little cottage. And he made a leather globe, hoping that children would be as excited about the world and all its differences as he was. We're told that really they would have rather used this globe to have a kickabout on the green that was opposite at the time. But he tried, and he made a map for them as well, which was teaching them geography. I'm not sure you call that at school, geography at school.
Yes,
Do you?
yes.
Oh, you do, yes. So he had this little school, and he also, while he was in this cottage, he made boots and shoes, and every 2 weeks he would walk into Kettering. I don't know whether any of you have ever been to Kettering. It's quite a long way to walk. But he would walk with boots that he'd made, and he'd come back with rolls of leather ready for the next batch. So that brought him a certain amount of income to look after them in their cottage. But while he was here, it was as if this map and this globe, as if they talked to him. The more he found out about the world, the more he thought to himself, Jesus said, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel." And what has the church been doing all these years since Jesus lived? And he decided, he wrote things on the map about where the church had been and shared the gospel with other people. But he found so many places that had never heard about Jesus, and he thought this was the church failing, and that they should be sharing the message of Jesus with the whole world. And he heard about, I've told you how much he was in love with the world and all its differences, but he was also very concerned about problems in the world. And he knew that there were really bad things going on in the world. If only, he thought, people knew how much God loved them and wanted them to love one another, how different it would be. And it would, won't it? And so, wherever he went, he would talk to Christians in churches about this idea of sharing the good news of Jesus with the world. And somebody said, if you want people to take notice of you, write it down in a book. Me? Write a book? He said. I don't think I could write a book. I've had such a poor education. And this man said, if you can't do it as you want to do it as you're able. And I think that was good advice, don't you?
Yes.
And so while he was here, he did start writing a book. And this is it. It doesn't look very special, does it? But this is a first edition of his book that he wrote. And in it, and that's a picture of him at the front there. It's got an incredibly long title. But this book, he poured all his ideas about how the church of his day could start sharing the good news of Jesus with the rest of the world. And when it was on sale, he was invited to speak at some very important meetings in Nottingham. And he preached a sermon saying we should expect great things from God and we should attempt great things for God. Have you heard that before? I know some of the grown-ups have. And he preached on that text, and it was all about making your tent bigger, thinking big, strengthening the stakes. And at the end of it, people were saying, "Oh, that was a good sermon, Mr. Carey." And then they were going to change the subject, as often happens with preachers. And Carey tugged the sleeve of an older man and said, "Sir, is still nothing going to be done?" For about 7 years, he'd been trying to share these ideas with people, and still nothing going to be done. So this man said, "Well, we'll meet in Kettering, in the house of, the posh house of one of my members. That house is still there in Kettering. And we'll sit round a table and we'll see if we can form a missionary society." And that's what happened. And then the big question is, well, where should we start? The world has so many problems, so many people in need of God's love. And somebody came along who said, it's India that needs Christian missionaries. I've been there. I speak Bengali, which they spoke in the northeast, and I would go if somebody would go with me. And it all ended up with Carey saying that he would go with him because he painted a very rosy picture of India, that the food was cheap and jobs were plentiful. And so Carey thought, well, perhaps I could volunteer. And then he has to go home and tell Dorothy what he said. "Oh, darling, I've agreed for us to go to India. What do you think?" she said. "Oh! You've told me there are tigers in India. You've told me there are poisonous snakes. You've told me there are crocodiles in India. And how could I go? I'm you'd have to go on your own, and you'd never come back if you went to somewhere as terrible as India. And so it was very difficult for several weeks. But Carey was so convinced that this was what God wanted him to do that Dorothy agreed in the end. All right, I'll let you go. And the decision was made that he would come back 3 years later, having made a home there. And then perhaps when this baby was 3 years old, perhaps she would say yes then, when she saw that he hadn't been devoured by tigers or bitten by snakes or gobbled up by crocodiles. And so the plan was that they went and waited to get the boat. And then came news. The baby had been born. Didn't know whether it was a boy or a girl or whatever. And so Carey wrote Dorothy a letter from where he was in the Isle of Wight, where he was catching a boat. And we have that very letter here. And this is the letter he wrote. And it was all folded up like that and addressed to Mrs. Carey, Piddington, near Northampton. No postcode or anything like that. And this was the letter, and you can see where the folds are, can't you? You see where the folds are? And this is one of my favourite treasures that we have. Do you know why? It's because it shows how much he loved Dorothy and how it was hurting him to leave her and his family behind. Because he says, "Oh, so glad to hear the baby's safely here. Do tell me what you called our dear little child." And he goes on to say that if he had all the world, he'd give it all away in order to be with her and their dear children. That's how much he loved her. But he couldn't turn back without guilt on his soul. In other words, he was so convinced it was what God wanted him to do that he couldn't say no to God. But that wasn't the end of the story, because the boat was delayed and they came back to where Dorothy was staying with her sister, not far from here. And they came back and they looked at the baby, and Carey said, "Dorothy, do you think you could come with me now?" And do you know what she said? No! And how could she take this tiny baby on a ship far, far away? But then, when Carey was leaving, he was so upset at having said goodbye a second time that his companion said, "I'm going to have one more try." And it ended up with Dorothy's sister saying, "If it'll make all the difference, I will come with you, Dorothy." And that's why we can see this whole party here waiting to get on this boat and go to India. And do you know how long it took them to get there? 5 whole months. A few hours today on an aeroplane, isn't it? 5 whole months it took them. And they were, because it's a sailing ship, the wind blew them across to South America, and it shipwrecked them going around the Cape of Good Hope, and the mast was broken. That mast on the ship was broken. But eventually they arrived to the eastern side of, not the west, the eastern side of India, and there they were, and there their troubles began. But they didn't find crocodiles or tigers and snakes. Well, not to start with anyway, because they were living in Calcutta, or Kolkata as it's called today, near there. And but the trouble was that they'd got through all their money in a month that was supposed to last them a year, and they became homeless, and they had to travel miles and miles and miles into the countryside, where they did find tigers and crocodiles and snakes. But fortunately, they survived. But it was very, very much in the country. And then Carey was just building a house for them to live in there when news came that somebody had found him a job. And so everything got into the boat, and a long, long river voyage, because that's how they travelled in India in those days. A long, long river journey to the north of India, where Carey had this job making purple dye from indigo plants. And it was a very good job, really. For the first time in his life, he had some money in his pocket. But it was a bit lonely there. And for quite a number of years, they had quite a lonely time, really. And then he heard that more missionaries were going to arrive to keep them company and work with them. And before they arrived properly, somebody came and said, the English aren't going to allow them to come onto this territory because it's ruled by the English at the moment, and they don't want Christian missionaries here. Will you come to Serampore, which is ruled by the Danes at the moment, Denmark, because they're much more welcoming to Christian missionaries. And so that's what they did. He lost a lot of money, all these houses and school and a new plantation that he bought ready to sustain the work of the mission. But it was the right decision to make, because in Serampore they founded this wonderful Christian community where everyone lived very simply, no luxuries, but they earned lots of money with their skills, and this meant that they were able to do all sorts of things like building churches and schools and lots of other things as well. They waited for 7 years before the first Indian became a Christian. That was a long time, wasn't it? Yeah. But Carey always knew, he felt a bit of a failure, really, that it took so long for anyone to find the gospel irresistible. But he always knew that it would be Indian Christians who would be the best evangelists to Indian people. And that's what happened. As soon as 1 or 2 Indians became Christians, they started talking about it to their families, and they said, I want to be a Christian too. And the church started to grow. So that was wonderful, wasn't it? They opened schools for children from Europe who would pay them good fees, and so that was money coming into the mission. And they opened free schools for Bengali children. And do you notice I say children, because they actually taught girls. There was one lady missionary who taught girls in that part, and girls weren't allowed to go to school in those days. They weren't here either. Dorothy had never been to school in this country, and William taught her to read and write in the cottage here. So it wasn't common for girls to go to school at all, but they introduced that part of India, girls to education, which was rather good, wasn't it? Yeah. And the final thing that they did many years later was to found a university, the first in Asia able to confer degrees. Things like BAs, BDs, and all those sort of things, MAs, by the authority of the King of Denmark, so that it was brought in line with the standards of universities in Denmark. So that was rather wonderful, wasn't it? That they were able to do that. And do you know what Carey was busy doing? He was busy translating the Bible into 6 Indian languages, not into your language, I'm afraid. Yours was one of the very few languages that he didn't Indian languages that he didn't translate the Bible into, but into 6 Indian languages, beginning with Bengali, and he learnt Sanskrit, which is the basis of so many Indian languages. So that helped him, and with the help of Indian scholars who he met along the way, he was able to create dictionaries and grammars and all sorts of textbooks. This little boy, or this young man who didn't think he could write that book, and all of a sudden he was finding he could even write in Bengali, write books in Bengali. And as I said, he became a famous scientist, and one of the ways in which he used his interest in agriculture and botany, that's flowers, and horticulture, was by forming the Agri-Horticultural Society of India. And do you know why? Because he was concerned about lots of people in India at the time hadn't got enough food to eat, they were going hungry, and he wanted to improve the range of food available. Remember, it's a long, long time ago, and also the availability. I think that's probably enough on that. Or would you like to go and have a little look in the church that he built? But it's not the same as it was in his day. And let me just tell you that those are not for sale. Those belong to the museum. One book is for sale at £4, but please help yourself to a bookmark just to remember. And I've got more of these. This is the English text of, a typewritten text of the letter. So a picture of the letter on the front, and that's what he says, typewritten and easier to read. So if you'd like to take one of those as well, I've got some more here. The other one is the Serampore Covenant, which grown-ups might be interested in. Because it's all they wanted to do while they were in India. I'm afraid it was in colonial days. People like me who are English have got a lot to be sad about, really, because they were there for what they could get out of India. But this makes it quite clear that the missionaries were there because they wanted to be good for India. And Carey believed that everybody, whether they were Indian or European, whether they were rich or poor, whether they were very, very clever or uneducated, they were all equally important to God. Do you believe that too? Yes. And so this for grown-ups, I think, is some of the things that they would read every few months. In Serampore and in the mission stations that they founded far away, just to remind themselves what it was that they were there for, and to remind the Indian missionaries as well that we were all equal in the sight of God, and we mustn't put any obstacles in the way of people coming to know Jesus. Like that. Anyway. We'll go and have a little look in the church, and then we'll go and have a little look in the cottage, all right? Because more people were finding faith in Jesus and coming along to church by the time he left than when they first came here. So that was good, wasn't it? Yes. And this is where today we open it up to baptise people. But in his day, he would have walked down the lane there to the sheep dip down the road. Not very hygienic. And he had the privilege of baptising Dorothy when he was the minister of this church. So we'll go and have a little look in here. And visitors on behalf of everyone, that would be good. But have a little look at this window. Because this is all about the ideas that developed in this place, and I think they still apply to us today, really. He thought that the church had a responsibility to talk about the love of God as shown in Jesus, Because God loved the whole world, we know that, don't we? And the love of Jesus is made known through the Bible, which everyone needs in their own language. That's what Carey believed. And that's what he tried to do. So I think I told you he translated the whole Bible into 6 Indian languages, and parts of it into 29 other languages in India, or dialogues. So that was quite a lot, wasn't it? And the Bengali New Testament, which was the very first thing that he did, it went into 8 revisions during his lifetime. He kept trying to improve it. And you know how long the Bible is. It's long even to read it all, let alone translate it all that number of times, isn't it? Yeah. Just one little look at this tablet here, which used to look like that before it fell off the wall when they were doing some work in the church. But we've got the middle bit here, look, and it's quite a funny tablet, really. It was put up by the church soon after he died, and it just shows how proud of him they were in this church, because it calls him illustrious. I bet you've never heard that word, have you? It's a very old-fashioned word, but it means someone very, very important. And Carey thought of himself as the most ordinary person there could be, because he was just this little village boy who'd had a very basic education. And he was a Doctor of Divinity. Well, that was an honorary degree. He didn't work for it as such, but given him by a university in America. The honoured founder of this place of worship. Well, he did rebuild it, but it was here a long time before he came. 4 years was the devoted pastor, well, 2 officially. Afterwards became the evangelist of India. I don't think so. He thought he wasn't very good as an evangelist. Professor of Sanskrit at the College of Fort William. Well, perhaps for the grown-ups that was really quite funny, because here he was teaching at an East India Company college who had been so against missionaries going there, and they were calling this little country boy with a basic education a professor of Sanskrit and other Indian languages, and he was training people from this country, posh boys, young men who were going to take up high office in the Indian civil service, and he was teaching them Indian languages and about Indian culture and things like that. And I think God was having a bit of a laugh over that, because God does do surprising things at times, and that was just about the most surprising thing he could do, isn't it? And he died when he was 72 years old, and that might seem quite young to you, I'm sure it does. But at that age, you know, with no antibiotics and no medicines, it was really quite a good age to live to in those days. And father of modern missions, after Carey had helped to found the Baptist Missionary Society, lots of other Christian denominations founded Bible societies as well. And you know, quite a lot of them would go and visit Serampore to try to find out what their experience had been and if they could benefit from their experience. So that was good too, wasn't it? Let's go and have a little look in the country where they lived, which has been knocked down and demolished. Because of course it's quite old, of course. It was here in 1785. I don't know how much longer than that. But there were a whole row of workmen's cottages all along here, and they were knocked down. And the church here at the time said, well, please don't knock this one down because somebody important lived here. And do you see it's got this bit of stone added to it here, which is called a buttress. And that was because once it was a terrace, part of a terrace, but now those buttresses are holding it up.
Okay.
And this is where Carey created a wonderful garden when he was here. And with lots of fruit and vegetables, which was quite important because we're told there was often no meat on the table when Carey was here, because they were really quite poor when they were here. And we're going into just a third of his cottage, and it's going to be a bit of a squash and a squeeze, but I think we'll all manage it. We're nearly all in, because in those all made shoes in a little cottage like this, a workman's cottage. And you see that trough in the wall there, that was the soaking leather. And they would fill it with a sort of brine that would make them nice and soft for working on the leather. And this is what Carey used. This was one of his tools. And you can see behind a bench, don't try sitting on it because it's only got 3 legs left and it's falling to pieces, but it is rather old. And he would have sat at one end of this astride with this between his knees like this, look. He would sit so that he had 2 hands free to work on the shoe. So that's called a clench. And I sometimes have people come here and say, oh yes, I remember my dad having one of those when he was making shoes, because this was a particularly shoemaking county. So that's what makes this a shoemaker's cottage. And we've got pairings of leather here that we were found in that trough when when we revamped the cottage here, quite a long time ago now. And that was what the cottages looked like. Look, can you see the thatched roofs? They're all getting worn out and leaky. And that's why they had to demolish these. And that's the one we're in now, look. And it's got the tablet on the wall saying that William Carey lived here. And that's just outside there. Now, this is what's left of his pulpit. You might have seen it on the mural in the room we were in. But originally, look, it was twice as high, with steps up to it. And this is what's left of it after all these years. And it doesn't look very nice, but it is the real thing. And you can see here the holes that were there for candles, because no electric light, of course, in those days. And behind you is the map Carey made. In fact, it's a very early copy of the map, but the person who made it said it was a very accurate copy, but it's not his handwriting. And you can see the big gaps in the world that he knew nothing about. Look, Canada over there, nothing about except that there were lots of pagans there, people who didn't know anything about Jesus. And the times he had to write pagans on the map made him very, very sad, because they'd never heard about Jesus. He'd read Captain Cook's diaries, journal, and he knew a lot about this area because Captain Cook, the great explorer, had been there. But look, he knows nothing at all about the west or the south coast of Australia. But it was this map that really talked to him about how much God needed the church to do something about sharing the message of Jesus with the world. And I still, who came from South Korea actually, but I have lots of Indian missionaries as well, who are doing exactly that today, sharing the message of Jesus with people in far-off countries. But we don't have to go to far-off countries to be missionaries, because we can share the love of Jesus with people who live with us, can't we? Yes. And who we meet in school or whatever. In which he was born, the little weaver's cottage. And he never forgot that he was just a humble little country boy. But when he was 6, he moved to the schoolhouse there, and this was the church he belonged to, where his dad was like a secretary of the church in those days. And this was the little meeting house in Hackleton where he found he could have a personal relationship with Jesus and became a Christian. And that's in Northampton, where he became a Baptist when he thought that being baptized as a Christian was part of obedience to God. That's what he thought. And this is the wonderful woman who pioneered education for girls in India. And John Thomas, who went with Carey, and Joshua Marshman, who was married to Hannah, and William Ward, who went out as a printer to start printing all the translations, and also using the printing presses for earning lots of money as well for the work of the mission. And he met very clever craftsmen in India who made all the, you won't know anything about movable type, but people, before the age of computers, people had tiny little pieces of metal with letters on them, and they had to put them in a stick. My dad was a printer, so I know. And made up all the words and all the paragraphs and all the spacing in between, not done on computers like it is today. And he found Indians who were very clever at making all the different fonts, because you know how all the different languages in India, they all have different fonts, don't they? And he met people like that who were clever at doing that, and that's how they were able to become a very famous printing press movement and publishing organisation. And what do you think those goblets and that plate were for? There was something he used while he was here. What do you think he used them for? Well, he used them when they celebrated communion at church. Yeah. And you see this, and he made a fabulous garden in Serampore, 5 acres, huge garden, everything laid out like a botanical garden. And somebody was there when the first tree he was said to have planted was cut down. And he brought some planks home with him, put them in his garage, then forgot all about it, and this man died. And they thought, where shall we send these, what shall we do with these planks of wood? I know, we'll send them to Malton. So they sent me these planks of wood, and we had them made into a bookcase. And the person said, you know, the funny thing is that it's plum wood, you know the fruit, plums, do you? Yeah. And plum wood is not, they're not native species to India at all. And do you know what I think happened? I think that when he was on that boat, he had a plum stone in his pocket. He'd probably eaten the plum, kept the stone, and he planted it when he got to India. And every time he got on a boat to move somewhere else, he'd put this little planted plum stone until eventually, when he came to Serampore, I'll plant this in the garden, he thought. Have you ever planted fruit seeds or fruit stones? Yes. I think that's probably how it's come. It makes me laugh a little bit that here it is, an English plum went all the way to India, and it's come back, and now it's a bookcase. Let me tell you just 2 stories before you go, and I'm sure you're feeling hungry. The first is about a pair of sandals, leather sandals. Carey had founded a church in Calcutta, and one day he was preaching in the pulpit, and he went up into the pulpit, and what did he find but a pair of leather sandals hanging in the pulpit? And he knew what they meant, because it was only the lower caste people who worked with leather in India at the time. I think it's probably still the case. And people were saying, you call yourself a professor and you're teaching these posh kids in this college, and we know who you really are. And so he took this pair of sandals and he waved them in the air, and he said, yes, I'm just a shoemaker from England. And if God can use a person like me. He can use all of us. Which shows that he wasn't really getting above himself, was he? He knew who he was really, even if he was called a professor. And the last story is about when he was dying, when he was 72, and he hadn't got long to last, and he was lying on his couch, and he'd hardly got any voice left. And a young missionary was visiting him and telling him all the wonderful things he'd done in his life. Until he could stand it no longer. And he said, "Pray." So this young missionary dutifully prayed, and then he was moving away, and he could hear a faint voice calling to him, so he went back and listened very carefully. And Carey said, "Oh, you've been talking about Dr. Carey this and Dr. Carey that. When I am gone, say nothing about Dr. Carey. Speak about Dr. Carey's Saviour." So it shows that he was still feeling very humble when he died. So why do you think people like me tell his story? Would he be cross, do you think? But the fact is, it isn't just Carey's story, is it? No. It's what God can do. And somebody says, "I will obey whatever you ask me to do." And God can do such wonderful things with such ordinary people when they say that. And I get a lot of people who come here and they read that letter and they think, this is my story too. I had to make sacrifices to do what God asked me to do. But it was worth it.
Yeah.
Has anyone got any questions? You've been very good at listening, you children. And I'm sure you're hungry and ready for something to eat, aren't you? Yeah, I'm sure you are. Yeah. But it's been lovely to meet you all.
Okay, thank you.
And
Thank
some
you,
of
thank
you
you very much for
meeting
your
you
time.
again.
Just for record.
People ask if it's published anywhere, but it would be dynamite to publish it. It's so politically incorrect these days.
Yes.
But of its time.